Hey everyone, this is Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we are talking about SLI GTX 960s. I tested two of Asus's Strix GTX 960 cards in SLI to see if the performance gain was actually noticeable, and if it is the value good when compared against NVIDIA's other offerings, the GTX 970 or 980, or AMD's R9 290X and similar cards. So a few things out of the way. We are using the Asus Strix GTX 960, which is the very same card that we reviewed in our GTX 960 review, but we've got two of them. As a quick recap, the Strix has a bolstered core clock and boost clock. It's got a bit faster memory clock by 190 megahertz, and all the stats are published in the article linked in the description below if you are curious about the specifications. So it is a bit faster than the reference GTX 960. It's also quieter, and it spins down the fans when less than 30 watt load is placed on the card. So if you're playing League of Legends or Dota, it will spin down the fan. So that is the card we are using. This video card is $210. So if you buy two of them, that puts you at just over $420. And then you've got other options nearby, like the GTX 970, which has 4 gigabytes of video RAM, a bit larger than this frame buffer, priced at around $350, so it's cheaper, got a larger frame buffer and a wider bus. And then you've got, obviously, the GTX 980, if you were to spend about $100 more than the SLI configuration, significantly more powerful. If you're buying AMD, there's a 290, 290X price range of about $300 to $400 these days, and then things like the 285 are nearby as well. So those are the configurations we're looking at when it comes to the value of SLI GTX 960s. And to sort of recap some of the concerns with SLI that we've had in the past years, generally there's a lack of support in video games for SLI configurations. That has been trending for the better in the last 2 years or so, and this does include Crossfire. At this point, when I say SLI, I do mean both Crossfire and SLI. Games have not supported multi-GPU configurations very well. They're finally starting to do that. And as NVIDIA and AMD both push for this support, we are seeing games increase their frame rates and actually playability with SLI configurations. Part of the incompatibility has triggered what's known as micro-stuttering. There's also tearing and frame drops and all sorts of issues that can stem from incompatibility with SLI or Crossfire, and those things mean that you have to disable one of your cards immediately, cutting your investment down to half of the original investment. So you're not even using one of your cards at this point, which makes it very difficult to justify SLI. So we're testing in this benchmark to see if that is still the case with modern games and AAA titles. Other than these concerns, we have concerns on the department of the GTX 960's memory bandwidth and memory interface. It is not quite as wide in terms of bit as its GTX 970 counterpart, which is cheaper than two 960s in SLI. All cards were tested using the latest NVIDIA drivers as of the posting of this video, and the latest AMD Omega Catalyst driver. As you can see, the GTX 980 is king of the Metro Last Light bench, with the 290X following shortly behind by AMD. The 970 is a bit behind both of those, but above the 960 SLI configuration. So already we're seeing the $400+ SLI configuration falling short to a $350 single card option. And then the 780 is behind that. The 780 these days, if you're not aware, can be obtained for about $300, making it very high value. But it underperforms compared to even SLI 960s, so we start to see the cards age. Moving on to Grid Autosports benchmark, the GTX 960s in SLI pushed about 100 FPS, which is within margin of error of the GTX 970's performance, so these are effectively identical. And the 780 and 980 both outperform these cards. Some of these discrepancies will be due to the game's software side optimization and what the developers have worked with when optimizing the game, so do keep that in mind. But even still, the 960s and SLI are not great value when compared to even NVIDIA's other offerings, and the value is still sort of questionable when compared to AMD's 290X or 290 offerings. Moving to Far Cry 4, we can see the GTX 980 tears away from everyone else, with the 960s following behind in SLI. So here's an instance where we don't have the GTX 970 on the bench because it was not available, unfortunately, for our Far Cry 4 testing. So we don't really have a great idea of where that falls. It's somewhere between the 780 and 980. But even still, the GTX 960s and SLI performed pretty well in Far Cry, and begin to be more justifiable in this instance. Unfortunately, this is the only instance thus far where they have been more easily justified, so it's not that versatile of a configuration as you can see by this test. Now, we did other tests using Battlefield 4 where we saw substantial improvement between the single 960 and SLI 960s, but still not great value. We also tested with Firestrike, which is a 3D Mark tool synthetic benchmark, showing a massive lead for the GTX 980 against pretty much everything else, and the SLI 960s were very close to the 290X. The only place where the GTX 960s and SLI really broke away from everyone else was in the 3D Mark Firestrike graphics and physics frame rate testing. These are independent tests of physics versus graphics rendering, and the 960s and SLI in this instance outperformed even the 980. This is sort of where we see issues with synthetic testing, and as soon as we did a combined test of both the physics and the graphics for the 960s, they fell short massively from everyone else. So this is an issue stemming from the memory bandwidth and memory interface limits that are imposed on the GTX 960. It does great with 1080p gaming that isn't very intensive from both the physics and graphics side simultaneously, but as soon as you introduce both of those elements, we see this shortcoming in the 960. Finally, I decided to do a higher resolution test in 1080 because I was curious to see if the memory bandwidth and interface would bottleneck the 960 to the point where it is not worth buying a second one. In our higher resolution tests, almost every game was very playable at the 2896 by 1629 resolution, and this remains true even at the 1% low dips, where they stayed above 30 FPS, so the dips were less noticeable. The only break to this rule is Far Cry 4, which had a lot of frame drop issues in SLI at a higher resolution, which is probably again pointing toward limitations of the bus, the memory bus on this GPU. Now, we also tested using Assassin's Creed Unity, and there's no chart for this because there were no results for this. Assassin's Creed Unity is so poorly optimized for SLI, and this is really more of a fault of Ubisoft, although NVIDIA worked closely with them, so it's on both parties. ACU had severe stuttering issues. The textures were flickering and tearing as we played the game, turning black, things like that. There were massive frame drops and lags where we would have upwards of a second of frozen screen time in Assassin's Creed Unity. So that showcases the general concern with SLI and Crossfire, and that these concerns are still alive and well, even with the extra push from all the GPU manufacturers and game companies to improve SLI and Crossfire compatibility. So the ultimate question, is an SLI configuration with GTX 960s worth it? Really, the answer is no, with one contingency. The value is poor when compared against even NVIDIA's other offerings, and especially AMD's offerings in nearby price points, and this is largely due to memory interface limitations. It's largely due to the fact that the 960 is meant to be a single card solution for 1080p gaming to begin with, so it wasn't really built for SLI, even though it is compatible with SLI. But the one contingency is a very specific use case. If you were to buy a single 960 today and you wanted to buy a second one in about a year to improve your performance, then I could see it being justifiable. At this point, if you're looking to spend $400, you are much better off buying a single card solution from either AMD or NVIDIA. And if you're thinking, well, I'll buy a 960 today, and then maybe in 2 or 3 years I'll buy a second one, don't get your hopes up on that, because every time we've ever looked into that option, it stops existing because the cards cease production, limiting you to used devices and very expensive devices because the demand is higher and the supply is almost non-existent. So that makes it a wiser choice to buy a single card to replace your single 960 in a couple years than it does to do SLI in a couple years with that 960. So that is all for this review. Check the channel for more information on video cards, graphics, computer hardware. We appreciate your subscriptions and support, and I will see you all next time. Peace.